So everyone, we want to welcome on Nat and the Guy. I'm going to go ahead and put their YouTube channel. It's going to be in the
Thank
link,
you.
so please
Oh,
consider
thank
checking
you.
that out. You all generously reached out to me and offered to be part of the show, and I was very excited to have you on. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
we actually moved from Canada a few months ago down to Mexico City just because of the crazy progressive policies and socialism that was happening in Canada.
Yeah.
And if people want to know what's going to happen under Kamala Harris, if she gets in the next 4 years, all this stuff has already been beta tested and pushed through in Canada, not just culturally, but legislatively. It's been absolutely insane. Free speech is now gone. It's been replaced by hate speech, compelled speech, and it's been implemented not only by the government, but by corporations themselves. Gun rights in Canada, there's more guns in Canada per capita per person than the United States. The only issue is if you use that gun to defend yourself or your home, if somebody breaks in, you're the one that's going to be prosecuted and not the people that are breaking into your home. It's just absolutely insane what happened in Canada, and it broke my heart to have to leave Canada. But there were certain red lines I just couldn't have crossed, and eventually I do want to have children, and Canada was just not a place I could raise them in. So yeah.
And I'm from Mexico. I moved to Canada about 13 years ago to go to college. And one of the first things I told him was, if we're ever going to have children, I'm not going to have them in Canada. And I was like very, very on the left originally, and then started realizing the craziness around 2015, 2016, because in Canada it just accelerated at a rate where I think even in the States, they haven't even gotten to the point where it is at right now in Canada. So we just worked our butts off and saved up a whole bunch of money and decided to just come back for me and come live a completely different life for him, but it's freeing in a lot of senses.
Now, I totally understand. You want to know what one of the great shames is? So I'm about 2 hours away from Erie, Pennsylvania. And then, of course, for people that know, Erie, it's just a small shot across the border to Canada. So Niagara Falls, there's a U.S. side of it, and then there's a Canadian side of it. That's the only time I've been out of the country, was going to the Canadian side of Niagara Falls. And if you go to Niagara Falls in Canada, it's sort of just like a touristy town. So I'm up there at 19 years old, and I'm kind of ashamed to admit this, but I went up there because I could legally drink. So I go up with some 19-year-old friends because it was 21 in the States. And hilariously, you meet people that were like 18 in Canada that are crossing the border south, because you could buy tobacco in the United States at 18, but you had to be 19 in Canada. So you have 19-year-olds leaving the U.S. to Canada to drink and 18-year-olds leaving Canada to the U.S. to smoke, which is kind of funny. But we got there and we decided one of the things we wanted to do was drive north to get out of the touristy thing. Canada is absolutely one of the most beautiful places I've ever been. It
Oh,
is
absolutely.
tremendous. And like, we went into these sort of like kind of what I would call rural towns in there. It was amazing. Everyone was so incredibly friendly. The landscape was just beautiful. And it's really sad. I have some fans of the show that are in Canada, to have them talk to me just about how devastating this, I think it's reached a culmination with Trudeau and sort of his government, but it's for years been these sort of progressive policies that are sort of destroying individual autonomy and freedom, that have led to one of the most beautiful countries in the world, I think, just being racked with devastation to the point where it's almost unrecognizable.
Yeah, we actually did a video. We do some political videos, but somebody had a video where they were fishing in a very remote stream in Canada, and they were going up the stream, and all of a sudden there's these guys in hazmat suits dumping buckets of poison into the river. And eventually, from that video, they uncovered that it was actually sanctioned by the Canadian government, and the two men in hazmat suits were being guarded by the RCMP, which is the Canadian police themselves. And all this was being sanctioned by the Canadian government. They decided to poison certain rivers in Canada because they said there was invasive fish species. But what they were doing were poisoning all the species in the river, which is just over governmentalization, and stuff like this is happening in the States with the CDC and things like this. And I'm really happy to see RFK on with Trump. I think that was a big transition and what really brought me on board even further than I already was with Trump.
Let me ask you this, both of you. First off, you don't mind me asking, you don't have to give your actual age, but around about how old you are.
In my early 30s.
Okay.
I'm 40. I'm 43 today, actually.
Oh, happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
I'm 40.
Thanks.
So let me ask you this. we hear the stories, and I'm so glad that you're here to talk about how disastrous things got. But what I'm interested in, and I think that really illustrates the dangers of Kamala and the Democratic Party and some of these disastrous policies that they're advocating for, where did you see the start of this? Because it didn't happen overnight, right? It was incremental.
No, well, for me, I again went to college. I was super woke, within the LGBTQ community, fighting for everything, feminist. I didn't like them, but I was part of it. So I started to see a lot of my friends and a lot of the communities kind of turning against each other. And I started looking for, other sources. And I saw how the Trudeau government started to encourage a lot of the madness that they were proposing, that even some of us were like, no, this is a bit too much. You're going overboard. It was starting to be sanctioned by the government, sanctioned by the universities, being encouraged. The whole transgender thing started to come up really heavily around 2013, 2014. And that's 2015 was when I was like, this is insane. They're starting to talk about children. They're starting to talk about there's no real gender. And then the government started also saying the exact same things. And it was like, well, one thing is the crazy activists. The other complete different thing is that now the whole society has to be on board with it, and you get punished if you're not. So I started to look for alternative sources, and then I kind of 180'd the other way almost. And in Mexico, it was still pretty conservative, but now we're also seeing all of this starting to come here. Like there's this whole notion of the Cassandra complex, where it's from Greek mythology, where this woman isn't believed. She knows the whole truth, she knows everything, but nobody believes her because she's cursed. That's how I felt there, and now that's how I felt here. And even with him, when we first started dating, he was kind of very apolitical, very removed. And I kept telling him all these things, and he would joke and call me baby Trump. And I was like, yeah, that's not an insult to me. But he didn't want to know anything about politics. And then during COVID, I think also right before, we kind of both started more noticing the things and where the government was heading. And then during COVID, it was just the implementation of policies, some of them not even having to do with COVID, but the wokeness and the trans rights and parental rights being taken away from parents.
I like to just add in, COVID woke me up, and then Trump, I kept calling her baby Trump. Yeah. And then she said, well, you need to research what you're calling me. And I did. And that was the second straw that really woke me up. But during COVID in Canada, protests were made illegal unless you were Indigenous. Mm-hmm. So certain protests were sanctioned and you're allowed to be in public, and Trudeau was out there with them. But other protests, if you were anti-vax or any other thing they deemed not good, you could be arrested for that. And they were checking passports and everything else. I had a fake vaccine passport at the time, so I got lucky.
That's awesome.
That was one of the main things.
Well, listen, I mean, that story sounds very familiar to Carlos and I. So we're both in the state of Pennsylvania. We had a governor named Tom Wolf. And Tom put out this big screed where he said people that were against his lockdowns here in Pennsylvania were cowards in the face of COVID. And that he would take away your license to operate a business. And he would take away the federal dollars that were being used as emergency funds during these lockdowns to help counties survive, if the county leaders were against his lockdown policies. Now imagine this. This means if you're a business owner, such as someone who owns a bar, and so you have to have a liquor license in Pennsylvania, you could have your license removed, not through any action you took, but because your representative at the county level disagreed with our governor. And so just like a dictator, he would strip away your license to operate a business. And he's denigrating you, calling you, again, you see the Orwellian language. You're a coward if you're against lockdowns. That's what they said. Then, after making these statements, what did he do? He violated his own order that said that you couldn't have a gathering of more than 50 people by going to Black Lives Matter rallies. And so on one hand, he told people that were just trying to go to work and provide for their families, no, you're not essential, you can't go. And if you do try to go, we'll take away your license to operate a business. And then at the very same time, he went out and violated his own order with complete impunity. And so I think it is a characteristic you see of many of these sort of left-wing wannabe dictators, that the rules that they seek to enforce on others are never applied to themselves. And I think in Canada, you saw a great example of that with the trucker rally. That's something that made world news. And one of the things you said that resonated with me there was it's not just the government, it's also you see corporations. Famously, not only did the government of Canada crack down on these trucker protests, but then you saw places like what it's not Give Send Go, what's the other one, where you could do
GoFundMe.
GoFundMe, right? Where GoFundMe was closing down these apps and banks were going after these truckers, private corporations. To me, that's real fascism and tyranny when you have private companies working with authoritarian leaders to go after politically undesirable people in ways like that.
Well, the very first video we ever did on our YouTube channel was very reluctantly. It was during that trucker protest in Canada. And so many red lines has been crossed, and I really didn't want to leave Canada. So I just started voicing my opinion. We went down to the border, started filming these trucker protests, and we were so scared to be on camera. We tried to do a voiceover. Eventually we got it. But if you look back on our YouTube channel, that's how we started, very reluctantly. And I think it's very important, if Trump manages to win this election, that on January 6th of this year, there's a good chance Kamala Harris is not going to certify that election because she is the vice president. And if that happens, I really urge all Americans to protest very peacefully, and much how the Canadians did manage their protests. And the truckers really managed to shut down that country in a very peaceful way. So the government had to pay attention to them, even though it was very reluctantly.
Yeah, and it's go ahead, Carlos. Sorry.
So I agree with you. First of all, greetings from Williamsport to you, Nat, and the guy. We are brethren, the United States and Canada.
Yep.
Can you talk about, and let me tell you, what they did to those truckers just made me ill, made me literally ill. Can you talk about, even though we're brethren democracies, can you talk about, and you probably know about our Constitution, can you talk about the safeguards that Canada doesn't have for you to be able to fight the way you want to fight? Because you don't seem like people that have lost faith in your country, Guy. You just want to be able to go someplace to regroup and start a family. And I hope at some point Nat and the guy invade Canada. So can you talk about the things that you weren't able to do that Americans take for granted? There's so much that you said that Americans can take for granted, that where we can fight back, where Canadians can't. Can you talk about that?
The Constitution protects you there. Free speech specifically. When I lived in the United States for a large portion of my life because my parents had died, and I moved back to Canada as an adult. And when I first moved there, it seemed like everybody had free speech. A lot of the laws were not implemented. They were legislatively passed. They had sat there dead for years. But when it came time for Trudeau to implement these policies, I was shocked that the lack of freedoms and rights the Canadian citizens actually have. And the primary right I see is free speech. You need to protect free speech with everything you have, because if that goes, everything else is going to go. I promise you that.
Can you talk about what free speech looks like in Canada? I mean, is it constitutionally protected? Tell us about that.
The thing is, within the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is essentially the Canadian Constitution, one part of it, there is free speech, but they've done this thing when they were writing it, where they put a notwithstanding clause. So a lot of the protections that are within Canada are guarded as well by a notwithstanding clause, which means that, for example, free speech is allowed and is protected, notwithstanding, for example, hate speech. So hate speech is not protected, but then that means there's no true free speech. And they've increasingly added what hate speech means and what can be punishable through hate speech. Same with journalism. And for example, the whole media system in Canada answers to the government because they're completely subsidized. So there's no real free speech avenues. And now they've also put in legislation.
There's no independent media there.
There is, but they're being blocked. So like Rebel News, for example, or True North, all of those, they are independent and they can still function within YouTube, but now the government has started to put pressures and started to put in bills to block off and tell YouTube and other sources what to do. And some of them have caved and some of them have tried not to, but becoming increasingly difficult for them to make any sort of money in Canada because of all of
Well,
these new bills.
What's happening right now is a mass exodus of political YouTubers from Canada. There's a couple new bills. I think one is C-293, and there's another bill, it may be C-63. These bills are going to create, you can get up to life in prison, which would be 25 years if it passes, for hate speech. And that's whatever the government deems. So a lot of political YouTubers are very scared, and there's a lot of censorship going on in Canada. I noticed when we had our YouTube station in Canada, it was being throttled. The Canadian government works hand in hand with these big corporations like Google and YouTube and things like that. Since we came to Mexico, we don't have a big channel, but it has just had nothing but support. We've created only 10 videos here in Mexico, and we've garnered almost 5,000 followers within a couple months.
And it's also
Wow.
because I do the videos in Spanish, but it's also because they're seeing that now with the election of Claudia Sheinbaum here in Mexico, which is essentially way more lefty than the one we had before, than AMLO, a lot of people are seeing that, I mean, the wokeness is going to increase tenfold, and it's just starting here. So there's a lot of people that are starting to feel disenfranchised who maybe voted for her, but are now realizing the consequences of that vote. And for example, they've started implementing the whole conversion therapy with trans children here. So like they're calling it conversion therapy, not to affirm a trans child and to try to maybe talk them out of it or see if there's other issues that are going on. That is now in Mexico deemed conversion therapy as well. So a lot of these laws that are very quietly being passed, not just in Canada, some are being tried to be passed in the United States, but thankfully it's a bit harder to do, at least in some ways in the US. But in Mexico, they've just been quietly passed and nobody really knows about it unless you really research it. And it is kind of, I mean, you either have Trudeau and then Kamala and then Claudia, which is like a complete northy, lefty, horrible
Yeah.
ideal, or, you know, Trump might be the one that can kind of bridge that gap and be the one that does something about
We
it.
worked with a gentleman in Vancouver. He's a little bit well known. You may have heard of him, Billboard Chris. We helped we helped design his website and worked with him a little bit while we were there. But the way the left in the United States tries to frame what's happening to conversion therapy within the United States, they're saying it's not happening on a mass scale. And I'll tell you what, that's what they said in Canada. And now they're going after the most vulnerable children in foster homes. There is a transgendered doctor who has now targeted 500 children within BC and within the BC foster home system. These children don't have parents. And if the social workers speak up against it, the social workers can be arrested because of Canadian law. So
let me guess. These people are doing this because they're picking on the most vulnerable people that don't have parents. And let me guess, the government is paying for it.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah, it's
It's about the money.
Yeah.
Again, it's all about the money. They don't care for these people at all.
No.
Otherwise, they would try to investigate why they're actually feeling that way.
Exactly
a lot of
right.
ABUSC is happening, and a lot of them have histories with horrible things happening to them. Nobody wants to talk about that. They just want to, you know, do the quick, easy, and profitable thing too.
We heard
Nat, what is the pronunciation of the gentleman that's running against
Trudeau?
Pierre.
Pierre Poilievre.
Yeah.
That's how I.
What are your thoughts about that man?
I really like Poilievre, and he's very Trumpy-ish, but the way the Canadian system is designed, I look at him with a lot more skepticism, because I know what traditional conservatives can do. I lived through George Bush. I understand they strip freedoms with the Patriot Act. Mm-hmm. Donald Trump is a new kind of Republican. He does not represent that. And I really hope Pierre Poilievre follows in Trump's footsteps. But if he goes the traditional conservative path, I'm just watching with skeptical eyes.
And there's something I always say, that now that the Liberals and Trudeau have put in all of these laws saying, for example, hate speech or any kind of laws that they might have put in that we disagree with, well, now the other side might be slightly scared because they can also start implementing them on the other side and become mean, they have all this framework now that they can switch however they want, and changing the laws now in Canada would be very, very hard. So, and I don't think if they'd want to, get rid of some of that power now that it's been put in their hands.
What a
do.
terrible thing. What a terrible thing.
I really liked Trump because even on the things I disagreed with him, he usually chose freedom. If I disagreed with him with the vaccines, at least, he kicked it down to the states. He left it up to individual choice, which even on things I disagree with Trump, he usually chooses freedom. And his supporters and his base, when he goes to his rallies and he starts preaching about the jibby jab or whatever, the crowd was booing him. And he listened to that and he slightly, changes his policies or changes his base really has a lot more control over him, where the elites have complete control over Kamala Harris.
That's an interesting point. It's something I've talked a lot about Trump. There's a lot of people. I think one mistake that some Trump supporters find themselves in is always agreeing with what Trump says. I think that's a huge mistake because to me, Trump's unique in the sense that, yes, you want an ideological person who's very intelligent and very much has like their roots in an ideology that you support. That's obviously what you would prefer in a position of leadership. But something that could be effective if you don't get that is someone who's willing to listen to their base and not just be stubbornly ideological to the point where they say, no, I don't care what you're saying. This is what I'm going to do. I think Trump is the least ideological president that we've ever had in my lifetime, which means, yes, that's a downside if you're someone who wants a strong constitutionalist or something like that. But it's a good thing in the sense that he's willing to be malleable. And if he sees that a bunch of people say, for example, he did the same on the Second Amendment with the bump stock ban, and he saw so many of his supporters were like, whoa, we're hesitant to have any sort of legislation that comes with, the dealing of limiting access to firearms, and he backed off on that. And I think he backed off a lot on sort of lockdowns and things of that nature as well, which he kicked to the state. So yeah, I think that's very astute of you to bring that up.
Well, I will also say that the left very often says Trump is a narcissist. And if he is a narcissist, I'm willing to take that because he wants love from the people and he wants his base to like him. He's listening to his base. So if his narcissism is allowing him to be malleable to his base and his supporters, I'll take a negative trait if we can use it as a positive outcome.
And he's also he's also pretty different than I think most politicians because he wants not for money or power. He had that already. So like that gives him almost a blank canvas of I'm not going to be chasing after what every single other politician is chasing after, which is ultimately power and money.
You're from different countries, Mexico and Canada. Do you view Obama as being a narcissist?
Now, like when Obama first
ever.
Now I do. Yeah, 100% completely, especially during this campaign. He's really revealed himself. I think he was able to hide it for such a long time. Even after I disliked Obama, I didn't view him as a narcissist. But during this campaign, the things he's saying to black voters and black men has really revealed himself to a new degree, which I always, I didn't necessarily like Obama, but I could understand why people did in the past. But I think he's burning bridges right now, him and Michelle, because Michelle really had the opportunity to maybe be the candidate. And I'm glad he's revealing himself because it's going to be much harder for her to run in the future.
Well, we'll let you go on this. I think you guys make a tremendous case. It's nice to talk to people from outside the country to see the perspectives of that have seen sort of this path gone down before to get that perspective. We put your link to your YouTube channel in the chat, but can you just tell us a little of what you have coming up, the type of content that you're going to be having, and where people can find you the most?
And your Twitter handle. If you could post your Twitter handle in the chat.
We could get that if you just send it to me.
Yeah,
I could do that. No problem.
Yeah, our channel was actually a reluctant channel we started where we were going to the border in Canada and most of our content was English. Since we moved to Mexico, we've transitioned to a Spanish content. So we're at a point now we're going to divide into two channels. So if you come to our channel right now, most of our recent content is going to be in Spanish and we'll soon start an English channel.
Trying to transition to having to.
But it's very political. It focuses on, I would say, what MAGA principles are that a lot of other countries need, because it's not just America needs their principles. The governments around the world need for their governments to start putting the people first, and the people are going to need to stand up if they want their governments to do that.
And right now, if there's any viewers in Spanish, I'm doing series about kind of explaining to the Mexican people what's happening with DEI, what's happening with feminism, because a lot of people have these ideas from the States, but don't really fully grasp them or know where they came from. They just know they should either follow them or not follow them. So I'm kind of doing an exposition of a lot of different topics on just kind of
Fantastic.
people what I've learned.
Fantastic. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to meet you guys. Thank you for coming, and thank you for fighting, and good luck with the future with your family, and you know, you have friends in America.
Thanks, Rob.
you.
Thanks, Carlos.
And thank you for having me.
Thank you all so much. We really appreciated it. And we'll get those links out there for you.